The moment I stepped in from the bakery, my hallway was a maze, blocked by 4 towering stacks of corrugated cardboard. My granddaughter glanced up from the sofa, phone in one hand, measuring tape in the other, and casually announced that she'd already settled my spot at the retirement community. "Pack light, Grandma," she'd chirped. "I need this space for my design studio as soon as possible." My name is Teresa. I'm 72 years old, and for 4 decades, I meticulously categorized documents, deeds, and wills in the municipal archives of this very city. She assumed my home was a blank page she could rewrite at will, but she forgot one crucial detail. Archivists never release a record without scrutinizing the fine print. That morning had begun with its usual clockwork precision, a routine I had catalogued and perfected over the years. It was Tuesday, the day the flour truck delivered to Mr. Elias's bakery on Honeysuckle Lane. I left my house at precisely 8 o'clock, my grey wool coat buttoned to the neck against the crisp chill that always swept down Main Street this time of year. Walking through my neighborhood was like flipping through a catalog of files I knew by heart. I knew exactly which neighbor had expanded their kitchen without the proper permits back in '98. I knew who had illegally subdivided their lot in the early 2000s, and I knew the true owners behind every commercial corner. For 40 years, my hands had organized folders, stamped resolutions, and archived the lives of all these people on the metal shelves of the city hall. The walk to the bakery took 10 minutes. My knees weren't as spry as they once were, but the unhurried pace allowed me to observe. I greeted Mrs. Carmen sweeping the sidewalk in front of her house with the green iron fence, the same house whose mortgage I'd seen cancelled in the '95 records. I waved to Julio, the retired mechanic, who was fine-tuning the engine of an antique sedan with the same patient precision I used to restore birth certificates damaged by damp. I bought my 3 sourdough rolls, paid with the exact change I'd separated into my right coat pocket, and began my journey home. The scent of warm yeast trailed with me, a small, comforting constant in a world that sometimes felt like it was coming undone. It was turning the corner onto my own block when I noticed the first anomaly in the familiar landscape. A white moving truck, one of those rented by the hour, was parked with 2 wheels on the sidewalk directly in front of my wrought iron gate. The license plate was from out of state. My gate, which I always triple locked, stood wide open, tapping lightly against the brick wall with every gust of wind. I felt no panic. Panic is a disorganized emotion, typical of those who don't know where to look for information. My mind operated as it always had, registering data, cataloging irregularities, preparing the groundwork for damage assessment. I ascended the 3 porch steps and crossed the threshold of my front door, which was also ajar. The first thing that assaulted me wasn't an image, but a smell. The industrial scent of new cardboard, Paco, adhesive, and bubble wrap. It was an invasive odor that immediately obliterated the familiar polish and toasted coffee aroma that always characterized my home. Then my eyes adjusted to the hallway light. There they were, boxes, dozens of them. They were stacked with no sense of structural balance, completely obstructing the natural path from the entrance to the living room. I stopped dead, holding my bag of warm bread against my chest. I observed the labels, scrawled in thick black marker, with the hurried, rounded handwriting modern youngsters used for everything. Linen fabrics. Read an immense box blocking access to the oak umbrella stand. Winter catalogs. Another dangerously stacked on a smaller box that looked ready to collapse. Color swatches do not crush indicated a third. The hallway, where my late husband Thomas and I had walked every day of our lives together, had been reduced to a narrow, wholesale warehouse aisle. I advanced carefully, sliding my body between the cardboard towers, feeling the friction of the material against the wool of my coat. The house was unusually cold. Someone had thrown the living room windows wide open. I reached the edge of the main parlor and paused in the doorway. My granddaughter, Valentina, stood in the center of the room. She wore dark fabric trousers and a designer sweater that looked intentionally distressed. She was 24, the exact age when I had already signed my first employment contract at the archive, paid the down payment on this very house, and was expecting my first and only child, Robert. Valentina, in contrast, held a laser distance meter aiming a small red dot at the far wall, just above where my crystal display cabinet rested. Beside her, perched on my floral tapestry sofa, was a young man dressed entirely in black, engrossed in a digital tablet. The young man typed furiously without looking up. 11 feet, 3 inches wide, Valentina dictated, still oblivious to my presence. If we knock down this drywall, we can integrate the kitchen light. The large window at the back gives us northern exposure, perfect for photographing fabrics. And the old furniture? The young man asked, vaguely gesturing with his digital stylus towards my display cabinet, my armchairs and the coffee table Thomas had hand-carved. That all goes first thing tomorrow, she replied, tucking the meter into her pocket. I've already ordered a dumpster for the rubble and trash. Whatever's salvageable can go to donations. I don't want any of this dust in here. I took a deliberate step forward, intentionally making the wooden floorboards creak beneath my shoe. The sound sliced through the air in the room. Valentina spun around instantly, startled, but her expression quickly shifted to a rehearsed smile, devoid of any genuine warmth. "Grandma!" she exclaimed, walking towards me with open arms, though she stopped a yard away, as if fearing the smell of the bakery would cling to her designer clothes. "So glad you're here. You left early, and I couldn't surprise you." I didn't return her greeting. My eyes methodically traveled from her face to the boxes in the hallway, then to the young man on the sofa, and finally back to her. I maintained an absolutely neutral expression. In the archives, I learned that silence is the most powerful extraction tool there is. People, unable to bear the void, end up saying far more than they intended. "What is all this, Valentina?" I asked, my voice low and level, without a tremor. She let out an exaggerated sigh, rolling her eyes towards the young man on the sofa, before looking back at me with an expression of manufactured patience, the kind one would use with a small child who didn't understand a simple instruction. She reached into a leather handbag and pulled out a glossy brochure printed on heavy cardstock, extending it to me. I took it by the edge. The cover showed a group of silver-haired seniors, dressed in immaculate sportswear, laughing exaggeratedly around a chessboard in a perfectly manicured garden. The title, in golden letters, read, "Sunset Residence, your well-being is our priority. The first semester is fully covered. It's a top-notch place. They have 2 4-hour nurses, gentle yoga classes, personalized menus. You need to pack quickly because I need this space here. The contractor comes Thursday to knock down the walls, and I can't have your things cluttering up." I opened the brochure, reading the subtitles: luxury shared rooms, constant medical supervision, flexible visiting hours. My mind, trained to seek discrepancies in documents, latched onto the keywords. "We paid," I repeated, pausing on the conjugation of the verb. "My dad and I, obviously," she replied, walking to the window and slamming it shut. "My dad totally agrees. He knows this house is too big for you alone. The front stairs are a constant danger. Besides, he signed the power of attorney last week. He granted me administration of the assets to expedite the whole process. It's for your well-being, Grandma. You need supervision, and I need a central studio to launch my clothing brand. It's a win-win." The young man on the sofa shifted uncomfortably, lowering his tablet, clearly sensing the geometric tension building in the room. "My well-being," I said, enunciating each syllable carefully, savoring the irony of the word. "Exactly," Valentina insisted, approaching me and attempting to place a hand on my shoulder, which I evaded with an imperceptible step backward. "You can't live here alone forever. You forget things. Last month, you left the garden hose running all afternoon. This house requires maintenance you can no longer provide. And honestly, the land value of this property is wasted on a leaky roof." My dad signed. "It's all legalized, so please go to your room and start sorting your clothes. You can only take 2 suitcases to the residence." I stared at her. I didn't shed a single tear. Crying blurs vision, and I needed to see the complete picture with absolute clarity. Robert, my son, the boy whose scraped knees I doctored, the man to whom I'd loaned money for his 3 failed businesses, the coward who hadn't the courage to look me in the face and tell me he wanted to discard me, had signed a paper, a signature traced in ink on a notarized document, giving his arrogant daughter control over what he assumed was his premature inheritance. While Valentina spoke of supervision and well-being, my archivist mind opened the drawer of operational memories. I saw countless afternoons at this very coffee table, teaching this very girl to cut out cardboard vowels because her parents were too busy fighting in their apartment. I saw the medical records I myself meticulously archived when she had pneumonia at age 8, the sleepless nights applying cool compresses to her forehead. I saw the tuition receipts Thomas and I quietly paid so she could study design, because Robert's salary was never enough. All that invisible work, all that structural care that had sustained this family for decades, had been classified by her as irrelevant. They were treating me like an obsolete document, taking up too much space on the main shelf, needing to be sent to the underground storage to make room for new acquisitions. But Valentina, in her haste to claim the space, had made a monumental miscalculation. She had assumed that the silence with which I conducted my life was synonymous with ignorance. She had confused the tranquility of widowhood with the passivity of dementia. "The moving truck," I said. My voice sounded as flat and professional as if I were working at the civil registry counter. "What exact time does it arrive tomorrow?" Valentina smiled, clearly relieved not to find resistance, assuming my practical question was a sign of unconditional surrender. "At 9 o'clock sharp," she said, checking her latest model phone screen. "The movers will come to pack the large furniture. At the same time, the transport from Sunset arrives to pick you up. I recommend you leave your suitcases ready by the front door tonight so you don't delay them." "Understood," was all I replied. I walked towards the dining room, navigating another tower of boxes containing threads and sewing patterns. I placed the paper bag with the 3 sourdough rolls exactly in the center of the wooden table, aligning it with the edge of the crocheted placemat. Every movement was deliberate. Then I turned and walked back down the hallway, looking neither at Valentina nor her silent assistant. "Where are you going?" she asked, with a slightly annoyed tone, as if my deviation from the script she had written in her head was a sign of disrespect. "You need to go to your room and pack." I didn't stop. I didn't give her the privilege of a response. I opened the front door, crossed the threshold onto the porch, and closed the door behind me, making sure the latch made that solid, definitive metallic click. The mid-morning sun struck my face, warming my cool skin. The neighborhood continued its course. Mrs. Carmen had finished sweeping and was now watering the geraniums in her clay pots, but her eyes were fixed on the white moving truck and my door. Julio had emerged from beneath the sedan and was wiping his greasy hands with a dark rag, frowning towards my property. The neighbors on Honeysuckle Lane weren't mere spectators. They were a closed ecosystem, a network of eyewitnesses who kept a mental record of every event that occurred on these sidewalks for 40 years. They knew who I was. They knew what this house represented. I walked to the edge of the porch. I rested a hand on the wrought iron railing, which I myself had sanded and repainted last spring, and opened my black leather handbag. I pushed aside my wallet, my reading glasses, and my blood pressure pill case. My fingers searched and found the familiar texture of worn synthetic leather. I pulled out my green notebook. It was a small, hardcover ledger whose edges were frayed from 4 decades of use. To any casual observer, it was just an old woman's address book. For me, it was the master index. There, meticulously noted, were the direct numbers for municipal inspectors, heads of public works, public notaries, and assistant archivists, people with whom I had shared coffee, whom I had helped find lost files in the city hall's basements. People who knew that when Teresa asked for a favor, it wasn't a favor. It was the collection of an institutional debt. I opened the notebook to the letter M. I ran my index finger down the lines written in blue ink until it stopped on a name underlined twice. Dr. Arthur Mendoza, former director of the property registry. My former boss, and above all, the lawyer who personally drafted the documents for this property in 1985 under my specific instructions. I pulled out my mobile phone, a device with large buttons that Robert had given me for my last birthday, complaining about how difficult it was to reach me. I dialed the 9 digits with methodical slowness, ensuring no errors. I brought the receiver to my ear. The phone rang. Once, twice, 3 times. "Hello?" Mendoza's deep, raspy voice answered on the other end, with the unmistakable background noise of a morning news broadcast. "Arthur, good morning. "Teresa here," I said, my voice firm, volume unaltered, knowing that Mrs. Carmen across the street had turned off her hose to listen better. "Teresita, what a miracle! To what do I owe the honor on a Tuesday morning? Do you need us to dig up some old paper in the archives for entertainment?" He joked, with the familiarity of old colleagues. "No, Arthur, it's not an old paper," I replied, staring fixedly at the white moving truck parked on my sidewalk, casting its shadow over my rose bushes. "I need you to come to my house tomorrow at 8:30 sharp. Bring your briefcase and bring the certified copy of the life estate and conditional property clause we drafted before Thomas passed away." There was a silence on the other end of the line. Mendoza's tone instantly changed, losing all trace of humor, replaced by the professional keenness of a man who recognizes a structural crisis. "Robert tried to make a move, didn't he?" he asked, lowering his voice. "Robert signed a broad power of attorney over to his daughter," I explained, distilling the facts to their purest essence. "Valentina is in my living room right now. She filled my hallway with boxes. She just informed me that they've paid for a semester at a retirement home and that a moving truck is coming tomorrow at 9 to empty the house and demolish the walls. She says she needs the space for a design studio and that it's for my well-being." I heard Mendoza exhale heavily through his nose. "A broad power of attorney over an asset he doesn't hold absolute title to," Mendoza murmured almost to himself, with that tone of forensic fascination we used when we uncovered real estate fraud in the archives. Such audacious ignorance. He assumed Thomas's succession gave him complete dominion. They didn't check the lien registry at the recorder's office, did they? Young people today don't read the fine print, Arthur. They think the world begins the day they decide to download an app, I said, feeling the cold breeze hit my face without flinching. They think they can pack up 40 years of a life and send it to a storage facility because a paper held a signature. "What do you want to do, Teresa?" Mendoza asked. The question wasn't one of doubt. It was a request for operational instructions. He knew my temperament. He knew I wasn't calling to cry or seek comfort. I was calling to activate a protocol. "I want the network present," I said, looking out at the street. "I'll talk to Julio, to Carmen, and to Elias today. I want witnesses. I want the entire neighborhood to see exactly how arrogance crumbles when it collides with the weight of the law. And I want you here at 8:30 with the documents in hand, half an hour before their truck arrives. I'll be there at 8:30, Teresa, with stamps, signatures, and the civil code under my arm. Let her pack, let her dream of her panoramic windows and her studio. The fall hurts more when they think they've already reached the top. Thank you, Arthur. See you tomorrow." I ended the call. I put the phone back in my bag, followed by the green notebook, and snapped the metal clasp shut with a dry click. I stood on the porch for a few more minutes, observing the street. My street, behind the wooden door. Behind me, I could hear the muffled sound of boxes being dragged across the parquet floor. Valentina's voice giving orders to the young man, planning the systematic destruction of my home. She was measuring walls, calculating light, distributing space in her mind, convinced her victory was a fait accompli, convinced I was just a fragile old woman who needed supervision. I adjusted the collar of my coat and descended the steps to the sidewalk. I had less than 24 hours before the truck arrived, and there were several visits I needed to make in the neighborhood. The machinery was in motion, and when the moving truck arrived the next morning, Valentina would discover, in the most humiliating way possible, that in this house and in this life, I was still the only one controlling the archive. I crossed the street with a firm stride, heading directly towards Julio, who was still wiping his hands with the rag. It was time to arrange my own chess pieces on the board, and the first piece was to ensure that tomorrow, at 9 in the morning, Honeysuckle Lane had the best possible view of the spectacle. When the truck arrived, boxes wouldn't be the only thing leaving through that door, but Valentina didn't know that yet, and silence until tomorrow would be my best ally. I crossed the street with firm steps, feeling the uneven asphalt under the soles of my comfortable shoes. The morning sun was beginning to warm the hoods of parked cars, but I felt a cold, metallic clarity in my chest. There was no room for sadness. Sadness is a poorly archived document that only gets in the way when you need to find the truth. Julio was still in front of his makeshift sidewalk workshop, wiping his calloused hands with the dark rag, his gaze fixed on the white truck that profaned the entrance to my house. "Julio," I called, stopping a yard from his toolbox. The smell of motor oil and hot metal was strangely comforting, an unalterable constant on Honeysuckle Lane. He looked up, squinting under the brim of his worn cap. His face, etched by decades of sun and hard work, reflected genuine concern. "Mrs. Teresa," he replied, lowering the rag. "I've been watching those outsiders for half an hour. That guy in black came out a while ago to smoke a cigarette and toss the butt into your rosebush. I was about to go over and give him a piece of my mind, but then I saw you coming from the bakery. What's going on? Are those boxes they're bringing in for the roof repairs you were planning?" I shook my head, maintaining my upright posture. "In the archives, when a file was corrupted, you didn't beat around the bush. You presented the damage as it was. Not repairs, Julio. It's my granddaughter, Valentina. She brought boxes to empty my house. She just informed me that my son, Robert, signed a notarized power of attorney over the property, and they've paid for the first semester at a retirement home. Tomorrow at 9 in the morning, the moving truck arrives to take my furniture and me with them. She says she needs the space for a design studio." Julio dropped the rag to the ground. The impact of the news blurred his features for a second, before indignation hardened his jaw. He knew Thomas. He had been at my husband's funeral. "A retirement home? Robert signed a paper to take you out of your own house?" Julio's voice rose, raspy and charged with a rage I refused to externalize myself. "But what nerve? That house is yours, Mrs. Teresa. You and Mr. Thomas built it brick by brick. I even helped you install that porch railing in '82. How can some spoiled little girl come and pack you up like old junk?" At that moment, the sound of shuffling steps interrupted us. Mrs. Carmen, who had been watering her geraniums, crossed the street, leaning heavily on her aluminum cane. Her plaid apron was damp at the edges, and her eyes, small and shrewd behind her thick glasses, gleamed with that protective curiosity only lifelong neighbors possess. "I heard everything," Teresa, Carmen said, stopping next to Julio, breathing with some difficulty. "I didn't mean to be nosy, but my right ear still works perfectly. Tell me it's a bad joke. Tell me Robert didn't dare to do such an atrocity." "It's no joke, Carmen," I replied, looking her in the eyes. "Valentina is inside right now, measuring my walls to tear them down. She thinks that just because she has a paper signed by her father, my entire life belongs to her. She thinks I'm a senile old woman who can't tell a contract from a napkin." Carmen tapped the tip of her cane against the asphalt, producing a dry clack. "That Robert was always a coward. Since he was a child, when he broke a window, he'd hide behind your skirt so Thomas wouldn't scold him, and now he's hiding behind his daughter. What a disgrace. What are you going to do, Teresa? If you want, I'll call my boys. In 10 minutes, we'll clear out that house of those people and throw their boxes into the street." I offered a very slight smile, barely a line on my lips. I appreciated the loyalty, but brute force is the recourse of those who lack documents. "We don't need violence, Carmen. We need witnesses," I said, lowering my voice so my words became a private pact between the three of us. "I just spoke with Dr. Mendoza. Tomorrow at 8:30 sharp, he'll be at my door with the original property documents. Valentina has made a catastrophic legal error, but I won't tell her now. I want the truck to arrive. I want her to feel like she owns the world." Julio crossed his arms, a spark of understanding illuminating his wrinkled face. He remembered very well when, in '92, the city tried to shut down his shop due to a zoning error. It was I who went down to the underground archive, found the original 1970 blueprint, and located the grandfather clause that saved his livelihood. Julio knew that when I spoke of papers, I spoke of sure victories. "I understand," the mechanic murmured, nodding slowly. "You want the kid to crash into the wall at full speed. I want her to learn that respect isn't demanded by shouting, it's imposed by demonstrating who holds the keys." I corrected him. "But I need your help. The moving truck arrives at 9. If they park in front of my door, they'll load everything quickly, and the scandal will stay inside the house." "Julio, do you still have that old tow truck? The one you use for hauling junk?" "I have it in the backyard, Mrs. Teresa. Works perfectly. Tomorrow at 8:45, I need your tow truck to suffer a mechanical malfunction, exactly at the corner of my sidewalk, coincidentally, so the moving truck can't pull up in front of my door and has to stay across the street, blocking traffic. I want every person who passes on Honeysuckle Lane to have to stop and look. Julio let out a raspy chuckle, showing his tobacco-stained teeth. Consider it done. That tow truck will die right at the perfect angle. Nobody will be able to move that moving truck without half the neighborhood knowing about it. I turned to Carmen. And you, Carmen, you have the neighborhood WhatsApp group, the one for Community Watch, the Eyes on the Street group? Yes, she replied, straightening her back with pride. I've got 42 neighbors in there, from Mrs. Rosa at the bakery to the school principal. Tomorrow at 8:30, send a message. Tell them there's a legal dispute at my house and I need the neighborhood support. Tell them to come out to their porches, to look out their windows. I want an audience. Valentina thinks she can make me invisible. Tomorrow, I want the entire neighborhood to see her. Don't you worry, Teresa, Carmen said, placing a warm hand on my arm. By 9 in the morning, this street is going to look like a 4th of July parade. That insolent girl doesn't know who she messed with. We're not furniture to be discarded. I thanked them both with a nod and turned away. The first phase of cataloging was complete. The stage was set, but an archivist's mind never rests with a single source of information. It always seeks data corroboration. Instead of returning to my house, where Valentina was still dictating measurements, I walked back towards the corner, heading for Mr. Elias's bakery. The journey was quick. As I entered, the bell above the door announced my presence. The place was empty at that hour, and Mr. Elias, a stout man with a white mustache, was arranging trays of meringues in the glass display case. "Teresita," he exclaimed, surprised to see me a second time that morning. "Did you forget something? Were the sourdough rolls hard?" "The rolls are perfect, Elias." "I've come to ask you something," I said, placing both hands on the cold Formica counter. "Yesterday afternoon, while I was at my blood pressure checkup, did anyone come asking questions about my house?" Elias frowned, wiping his hands on his immaculate apron. His expression turned serious, as if he suddenly connected a series of disjointed facts. "Well, now that you mention it, yes. Yesterday, after 4, a very well-dressed young woman came in with an expensive coat and dark glasses that she didn't take off even to talk to me. She asked for imported mineral water, which, obviously, I don't sell." "And what did she ask you?" I probed, maintaining neutrality in my voice. "She asked about neighborhood safety. She said she was evaluating investing in a commercial space on this block, but she was concerned about the demographic profile. That's how she put it. Demographic profile. She asked if many police patrols pass by here, and if the neighbors were very problematic. I told her this is an older neighborhood, retirees, nothing ever happens here. And she made a face as if she were disgusted and murmured something about having to change the facade of the entire sector to attract her clientele. Then she stood in front of the bakery window and stared at your house, Teresita, for quite a while. She was writing things down on her phone. I nodded slowly. Valentina's arrogance wasn't a spontaneous outburst this morning. It was a calculated project. She had come to survey the territory while I was away, evaluating the environment as if she already owned every square foot. "That young woman is my granddaughter, Elias," I said bluntly. "Tomorrow at 9, she's bringing a truck to empty my house and send me to a retirement home." Elias's eyes widened, and a flush of indignation rose on his thick neck. "What? But you're sharper than I am. How dare she? I'll go myself and chase her out with a broom." "It won't be necessary, Elias. I only ask one thing of you. Tomorrow, before 9, prepare 2 large thermoses of your best coffee and bring them to the sidewalk in front of my house. Dr. Mendoza will be there, and several neighbors too. It's going to be a long morning, and we'll need something warm while we watch a house of cards crumble." The baker nodded firmly, striking the counter with the palm of his hand. "I'll be there, Teresa, with coffee, cups, and even some pastries. Nobody messes with ours." I left the bakery feeling that the structure of my defense was now impenetrable. Community wasn't an abstract concept. It was a network of people who had shared joys, sorrows, and routines for 40 years. Valentina believed power resided in a paper signed by an absentee son. but she ignored that true power resided in the collective memory of a place. I returned to my house. The rented moving truck was no longer parked on the sidewalk. I assumed the assistant in black had gone to find more boxes or coordinate the dumpster. I climbed the porch steps and entered. The interior of my home seemed to have aged 10 years in the 2 hours I was away. The boxes in the hallway had multiplied. The smell of cardboard and adhesive tape was suffocating. I walked towards the living room, but it was empty. I heard noises coming from the back of the hallway, my bedroom. My heart gave a dull thump against my ribs, but my face didn't alter its expression. I walked with silent steps across the parquet floor until I reached the frame of my bedroom door. There was Valentina. She'd opened the doors of my oak wardrobe. My clothes, my dresses organized by season, my winter coats, everything had been pushed aside. In the center of my bed, on the hand-knitted quilt my mother gave me when I married, were 3 large black garbage bags, the kind used for yard waste. Valentina held a cedar wood box in her hands. It was Thomas's cigar box. Inside, I kept not tobacco, but the letters we wrote to each other during our courtship, Robert's first sonograms, and my municipal service medals. My granddaughter opened the box without the slightest hesitation. She looked at the yellowed papers with an expression of absolute boredom. "This is just trash," she murmured to herself, making a gesture as if to dump the contents of the cedar box into one of the black bags. "That document is not cleared for discard," I said. My voice cut through the silence of the room like a guillotine blade. Valentina jumped, letting out a small shriek of surprise. The cedar box slipped from her hands, but I managed 2 quick steps and caught it in midair before it hit the floor. A conditioned reflex from years of preventing historical documents from being ruined. I held the box against my chest and looked her in the eyes. The coldness of my gaze must have frightened her because she recoiled a step, bumping against the edge of the bed. "Grandma, you scared me," she said, putting a hand to her chest, quickly trying to regain her superior posture. "You shouldn't walk around so quietly. You could fall." "What are you doing in my bedroom, Valentina?" I asked, ignoring her false tone of concern. "I'm helping you, obviously," she replied, pointing to the black bags. "Since you left without saying anything, I assumed you were overwhelmed. Seniors often freeze up during moves. It's normal. So I started separating what goes to donation and what goes to trash to the residents. Sunset. You can't take these antiques. There's no space. They have a minimalist policy to prevent accidents." I pressed the cedar box against me. "I didn't give you permission to touch my personal archives." Valentina rolled her eyes and let out a dry, exasperated laugh. "Grandma, please. They're not archives. They're old papers that collect dust mites. You have to learn to let go of the past. My dad warned me you'd be stubborn, that you'd cling to material things, but understand that this isn't yours anymore. My dad is the legal owner, and he authorized me to clear the property. I'm doing you a favor. If it were up to the contractors, they'd toss all this into the street tomorrow. I left 3 suitcases in the bathroom. You have until dinner to choose your clothes. Tomorrow at 9, there's no turning back." She crossed her arms, waiting for me to erupt, waiting for tears, pleas, or a fit of rage that she could record on her phone to show the nursing home doctors how unstable I was. But I am a woman of archives, and archives don't scream. They document. "Understood," I said with glacial calm. I turned, carrying the cedar box with me, and left the room without another word. I heard Valentina huff behind me, frustrated by my lack of drama. I heard her say something about stubborn old people, followed by the sound of her designer footsteps moving away towards the kitchen. Her phone rang. "Hello? Yes, Fernando, tell me." I heard her speak from the hallway, her voice instantly changing to a professional, fawning tone. "Yes, I'm already on the property." "No, the clearance is first thing tomorrow. By Friday, you'll have the room empty for your contractors to come in." "Yes, the internal demolition permits are already paid for." I walked to the dining room. Valentina had left her leather handbag open on the table next to my bread bag. Beside her bag was a transparent plastic folder with several printed documents. Valentina was still in the kitchen, speaking loudly, discussing epoxy paint colors for the floor. I approached the table. My eyes, trained for 40 years to scan legal texts at high speed, settled on the first page of the document inside the clear folder. The title was in bold: Investment Contract and Commercial Partnership Agreement. I didn't need to touch the paper to read the first paragraph. The contract established a partnership between Valentina and a group called San Roman Investments. The investor was contributing $50,000 for machinery and inventory for Valentina's clothing brand. In return, Valentina was contributing the property located on Honeysuckle Lane as the headquarters and collateral for the business. But it was the penalty clause in the third paragraph that made my breathing stop for a fraction of a second. In the event that the receiving party, Valentina, does not deliver physical possession and clear occupancy of the aforementioned property before Friday of the current week for the commencement of works, the contract will be null and void, and the receiving party must return the full capital, plus a penalty for damages equivalent to 100% of the amount contributed. Valentina wasn't just arrogant, she was desperate. She had signed a brutal financial contract using a house that didn't belong to her as collateral, assuming my son, Robert, had absolute title because he was my husband's natural heir. She had gambled her future, her brand, and an amount of money she could never repay, based on the absolute certainty that I would surrender without a fight, that I was just a silent obstacle that could be packed away into a nursing home. Now I understood the haste, the quick movers, the prepaid nursing home, the pressure to clear the house immediately. If I didn't leave this house tomorrow, Valentina would be in breach of contract with San Roman Investments. Her financial ruin would be absolute and irreversible. I memorized the investor's name and the amount. I stepped back just as Valentina's heels resonated, returning from the kitchen. "I'm telling you, Fernando, we start on Friday, don't worry," she said, ending the call. "Grandma, I have to go meet with the lighting suppliers. I'll be back tomorrow at 8:30 sharp to supervise the movers and make sure you get into the nursing home transport with your things. Please don't make my life difficult. Pack your bags." She grabbed her handbag and the transparent folder, oblivious that I had just read her financial death sentence. She headed towards the front door. "Until tomorrow, Valentina," I said, my voice flat, devoid of any human emotion. She paused for a second, as if my tone had sent an unconscious shiver down her spine. But her arrogance was stronger. She opened the door and left without saying goodbye, slamming it shut so hard the window panes rattled. Silence fell over the house abruptly, heavy and dusty. I stood alone in the middle of the hallway, surrounded by the cardboard towers bearing the name of her stupid clothing brand. The afternoon light began to filter through the windows, casting long shadows across the parquet floor. I went to the kitchen, put the kettle on the stove. While the water boiled, I walked to the small hallway that connected to the bathroom. There, on the wall, behind a landscape painting Thomas bought on our honeymoon, was a small built-in safe. I opened it with the combination Robert never bothered to learn. The date I started working at the municipal archive. I took out a thick manila envelope. Inside was the original deed to the house, and attached with a rusted metal clip was the annex Dr. Mendoza had drafted 15 years ago. The life estate clause, a legal document registered and sealed at the property registry that established that although Robert would inherit the bare ownership after Thomas's death, I retained absolute use, enjoyment, and dominion over the house until the day I died. Robert could not sell it, he could not rent it, and of course, he could not cede its administration to his daughter to turn it into a design studio. The power Robert had signed wasn't worth the paper it was printed on. I took the envelope and placed it on the dining table, right next to my bag of sourdough rolls. I prepared my tea. I sat in the only chair not blocked by boxes. I drank the hot liquid in small sips, feeling the warmth comfort my chest. I looked at the wall clock. It was 6 in the evening. Valentina believed time was on her side. She believed the night would be my torture, the moment I would break down packing my memories. But she understood nothing about archival timelines. Documents wait in the dark for decades, silent, collecting dust, until someone brings them to light. And when they emerge, they have the power to destroy lives, to nullify contracts, to erase entire futures with a single stroke. Tomorrow at 9, Valentina would discover that the old woman she tried to discard would not only refuse to leave the house, but she would also discover that, through her own ignorance, she had just dug a $100,000 pit from which no one, not her cowardly father, nor her arrogant attitude could rescue her. The kettle water was still warm. The neighbor network was ready. The documents were on the table. The trap was set. Now, all that remained was to wait for the moving truck to start its engine. I washed my teacup with the deliberate slowness of someone who knows that time, far from being an enemy, is the best torture mechanism for the impatient. The water ran over the white ceramic, dragging the remnants of chamomile leaves toward the stainless drain. I turned off the faucet, dried the cup with a clean cotton cloth, placed it on the top shelf of the cupboard, and stood in the middle of the kitchen, listening to the unnatural silence of my own house. The walls seemed to shrink, suffocated by the dozens of cardboard boxes Valentina had ordered piled in the hallways. The smell of industrial glue and packing dust had penetrated the curtains, the cushions, the wood of the baseboards. I walked toward the central corridor, stopping in front of a tower of boxes that blocked access to the guest bathroom. Color swatches, do not crush. I read again on the label written with a black marker. My hand brushed the corrugated surface of the box. The rough touch of the cardboard acted as a trigger in my memory, opening an archive drawer I had kept locked for over 2 decades. It was a winter Tuesday in 1998. Robert, my son, was sitting in the exact same spot where Valentina's assistant had sat today. He was 32 then, his hair disheveled, his hands trembling from too much coffee and lack of sleep. His second business, a video store downtown, was on the verge of bankruptcy. Thomas and I stood in front of him. Robert cried. Large tears of self-pity rolled down his poorly shaved cheeks, begging us to mortgage this very house to inject capital into his failed venture. "It's just a signature, Dad," Robert had said, clasping his hands in a pleading gesture that turned my stomach. "The bank gives us the check tomorrow. In 6 months, I'll recover everything and pay off the mortgage. This house is just a pile of old bricks. I'm your son. Are you going to let me be ruined to protect some bricks?" I showed him the receipts for the debts we had quietly covered. When I finished reading, Robert stood up, kicked the coffee table his father had hand-carved, and screamed that we were selfish old people who preferred hugging our walls to our own flesh and blood. He stormed out, slamming the door exactly as his daughter would do 26 years later. That was the day I catalogued my son. I understood, with the cold precision of an archivist, classifying a damaged document, that for Robert, family love was a financial transaction. We weren't his parents. We were his emergency fund, his venture capital, his insurance against failure, and this house was never his home. It was just a bearer check waiting to be cashed. I removed my hand from the cardboard box. The echo of the 1998 door slam faded in the hallway, but the lesson remained intact. The sharp, shrill sound of the landline phone cut through the heavy air of the living room. I started for a fraction of a second, but my breathing stabilized immediately. The device, an old cream plastic model mounted on the kitchen wall, continued to ring once, twice, 3 times. I walked toward it with a firm stride, picked up the receiver, and held it to my ear without saying a word. I waited. In the archives, whoever speaks first reveals their need. "Mom?" Robert's voice sounded on the other end of the line, distorted by static and laden with nervous urgency. "Mom? It's me. Can you hear me?" "I hear you, Robert," I replied, maintaining a neutral tone, the same one I used when dealing with lawyers seeking lost deeds. I heard a sigh on the other end, the sound of someone trying to muster courage. "Valentina just called me from her car. She said you were rude to her, that you refused to pack your things, and that you locked yourself in your room with an old wooden box. Mom, please, don't make this any harder than it already is. I'm in the middle of month end, close at the office. I don't have time to deal with your whims." "My whims?" I repeated, savoring the choice of word. "Yes, your whims. I know it's hard to leave the house, but you have to be reasonable. Dr. Suarez told me the last time he saw you that you're no longer in a condition to live alone. The stairs, the gas, the cleaning, it's a hazard. The Sunset residence costs a fortune, but Valentina and I made the effort to pay for it in advance because we want the best for you. They have beautiful gardens. You'll have company." "Valentina informed me that you signed a broad power of attorney over the property," I said, completely ignoring his monologue about gardens and doctors. I went straight to the structural core of the problem. Robert coughed. clearly uncomfortable with my change of subject. Yes, I did last week. Valentina found some incredible investors for her clothing brand. It's the opportunity of a lifetime, Mom, and she needs a central, spacious location. The house was going to waste. You only used 2 rooms. It was logical. I ceded the administration so she could sign the renovation contracts without having to bother me all the time. It's a standard procedure. I gripped the receiver tightly. My son's ignorance was so vast it was almost fascinating to observe in action. Did you read the contract Valentina signed with San Roman Investments, Robert? I asked, sliding the company name in with the precision of a scalpel. There was a long silence on the line. What contract? Valentina handles her business affairs. I just gave her power over the property so she could use it as a base of operations. Mom, don't try to change the subject. Tomorrow at 9, the truck and the residence transport arrive. I need you to have your suitcases ready at the door. I won't let you ruin my daughter's project over a fit of nostalgia. Don't worry about my suitcases, Robert. Tomorrow at 9, your daughter and I will have everything exactly where it needs to be. I'm glad to hear that, he said, his voice immediately relaxing, assuming my answer was total capitulation. I knew you'd see reason. I promise I'll visit you at the residence on Sunday. I'll bring you those dark chocolates you like. Rest, Mom. Good night, Robert. I hung up the phone on its wall mount. The metallic click echoed in the empty kitchen. Robert had just confirmed what I suspected. He had no idea about the $100,000 penalty clause. He had signed a blind power of attorney, handing his daughter a loaded weapon without checking if the safety was on. And Valentina, in her arrogance, had pulled the trigger, aiming at her own foot. I left the kitchen in darkness and walked down the hallway to my bedroom. Navigating the boxes in the gloom required perfect muscle memory, the same that allowed me to navigate the underground corridors of the archive without turning on the lights. I reached my room and turned on the small nightstand lamp. On the bed, the hand-knitted quilt was still wrinkled. In the center, like 3 monuments to disrespect, rested the black trash bags Valentina had left for me to throw my life away. I approached the bed, took the first bag by the bottom, and shook it. It was empty. I took the second and third, folded them methodically into small squares, and put them in the bottom drawer of my closet. Then I sat on the edge of the mattress and ran my hand over the smooth wood of Thomas's cedar box, which rested safely on my pillow. The smell of antique wood and wax immediately transported me to another memory, the second classified file on the true nature of this family. The year 2015. It had been barely 48 hours since we had buried Thomas. The house was full of neighbors, half-empty coffee cups, and the respectful murmur of mourning. I was sitting in this very room with the door ajar, unable to go out and face the condolences. Valentina was 15. She wore a black dress that seemed more appropriate for a party than a funeral, and walked around the living room with her phone in her hand. Through the crack in the door, I saw her approach the dining table. The large, solid mahogany table that Thomas had bought with his first significant bonus. Valentina ran a hand over the polished wood, but there was no sadness in her gesture. There was no memory of the grandfather who taught her to play cards on that very surface. She looked up at her father, Robert, who was leaning against the window frame, eating a sandwich. "Hey, Dad," Valentina had said, her voice clear and devoid of any tone of grief. "How much do you think we'd get for this table at an antique store? If we sell this and the display cabinets, I could easily afford the car I want when I turn 18. I mean, Grandma isn't going to host big dinners by herself anymore. It's ridiculous that it takes up so much space. My widowhood wasn't a family tragedy. It was a real estate opportunity. Valentina saw me as a temporary obstacle, just another piece of furniture occupying space in the house she already considered hers. The lack of empathy wasn't a teenage flaw. It was a character trait her father had nurtured with his cowardice. I opened my eyes, bringing myself back to the present. The cedar box under my hands was cold. I stood up. I wasn't going to sleep tonight. An archivist's mind races when the deadline for a critical file approaches. I went to the bathroom, washed my face with ice-cold water, and began to prepare my armor. I took my navy blue 2-piece suit from my closet. It was the same suit I wore the day I was appointed head of the Civil Records section in 1990. The fabric, of impeccable quality. Didn't have a single wrinkle. I ironed the white silk blouse with slow, precise movements, making sure the collars were perfectly crisp. I polished my low-heeled shoes, the comfortable yet formal ones that made a dry, authoritative sound when walking on the parquet. It was 4 a.m. when I finished dressing. I pinned the pearl brooch Thomas gave me on our silver anniversary right on the left lapel of my jacket. I looked at myself in the full-length mirror. There was no fragility in my reflection. No disoriented old woman who needed supervision. There was a woman who knew the weight of the law and was about to drop that weight on the heads of those who tried to erase her. I went to the dining room. I turned on the central light, illuminating the manila envelope resting on the table next to my leather handbag. The envelope contained the third memory, the heaviest of all, the centerpiece of this chessboard. The year 2008. Dr. Arthur Mendoza's office on the second floor of the property registry building. Outside, it was pouring rain. Thomas sat beside me, breathing with difficulty. 2 weeks prior, he had been diagnosed with the pulmonary emphysema that would kill him 7 years later. Mendoza was on the other side of his massive mahogany desk, glasses perched on the tip of his nose, reading the document he had just printed. Life Estate Mendoza had read aloud, lowering the papers and looking my husband directly in the eyes. "Thomas, old friend, are you absolutely sure about this? You're leaving Teresa with full dominion over the use and enjoyment of the property until the day she dies? But you're naming Robert as the heir to the bare ownership of your hearth. That means that when you're gone, Robert will own the paper, but he won't be able to touch a single brick, sell, rent, or evict Teresa as long as she breathes. Robert will hate this. He'll feel like you handed him a safe without the combination. Robert thinks the world owes him something just for existing," Thomas had replied, his voice raspy. "If I leave him the property free and clear, he'll mortgage it in his next failed business venture. Or worse, he'll convince Teresa to sell it to help him, and she'll end up on the street. This house is my wife's shield. Make the document bulletproof. If Robert wants the house, he'll have to wait until Teresa closes her eyes forever. And knowing my wife's strength, Robert will be an old man by then. And now, 16 years after that rainy afternoon, the shield was about to be tested." Robert had forgotten the existence of this document. Or worse, in his infinite administrative laziness, he never bothered to check the lien records before signing the power of attorney over to Valentina. He assumed his father's death automatically made him king of the castle. I picked up the manila envelope. I checked one last time that the original deed and the life estate annex were intact, and placed it inside my black leather handbag, securing the metal clasp. I looked at the kitchen wall clock. 5:30 in the morning. I made coffee. Not just any coffee, strong black coffee, the kind I drank on general inventory days at the archive. The aroma filled the kitchen, masking for a moment the smell of cardboard and glue from Valentina's boxes. I sat in the chair with a straight back, a hot cup between my hands, and waited for the sun to begin to rise. At 7:15, the neighborhood began to wake up. I got up and walked to the living room window, opening a small gap between the heavy velvet curtains. Honeysuckle Lane was shrouded in that thin, cold mist, typical of dawn. The moisture shimmered on the asphalt. At 7:30, I saw Julio's garage door open with a metallic screech that broke the silence of the block. The old mechanic came out walking quickly, rubbing his hands against the cold. He went into his backyard, and 5 minutes later, the diesel engine of his tow truck coughed, spat black smoke, and roared to life. Julio maneuvered the heavy, rusted vehicle, pulling it onto the street. He drove it at a snail's pace to the exact corner of my sidewalk, the only possible angle where a large truck would have to maneuver to pull up in front of my door. I watched Julio turn off the engine. He got out of the cab, walked to the front of the tow truck, opened the hood, and bent down, pretending to inspect a critical failure. He placed 2 dirty orange cones around the vehicle. The physical trap was set. The tow truck perfectly blocked the turning radius. At 7:45, the door of the house with the green iron fence opened. Mrs. Carmen came out to the sidewalk. She wore a thick wool coat and carried her aluminum cane. She didn't start sweeping. Instead, she unfolded a canvas folding chair right at the edge of her porch. She sat down with a blanket over her legs and pulled out her mobile phone. I saw her typing furiously with her thumbs. She was activating the network. In less than 10 minutes, the lights on the porches of neighboring houses began to turn on one by one, like fireflies responding to an alarm signal. At 8 sharp, Mr. Elias, the baker, appeared turning the corner. He was pushing a small metal cart with wheels, on which he had placed a folding table, 2 giant stainless steel thermoses, a tower of thermal cups, and a tray covered with aluminum foil. He crossed the street, greeted Julio with a nod, and set up his coffee station exactly at the edge of my front yard, next to my rose bushes. The neighborhood wasn't just watching. The neighborhood was taking tactical positions. At 8:15, a dark gray sedan, impeccably clean, parked behind Julio's broken-down tow truck. The driver's door opened, and Dr. Arthur Mendoza descended from the vehicle. He wore a black wool coat, a gray cashmere scarf, and in his right hand, his inseparable brown leather briefcase. His white hair was perfectly combed back. He walked to my porch, looked at the lit lights of the neighboring houses, looked at Elias's coffee station, and offered an imperceptible smile. Mendoza climbed my 3 steps and stopped in front of my door, waiting like the implacable notary he always was. At 8:20, I opened the front door. The icy morning air hit my face, but I didn't flinch. Mendoza looked me up and down, evaluating my navy blue suit, my upright posture, and the absolute lack of fear in my expression. "You're just as you were the day you shut down the Central Archive, because the mayor tried to remove documents without authorization, Teresa," Mendoza said, his raspy voice resonating on the porch. "A fortress. The invaders are on their way, Arthur." Mendoza patted his leather briefcase, folio by folio, recent confirmations from the current registrar. "So they can't say the papers are old. The life estate is as valid as the rising sun." I approached the porch railing. Mrs. Carmen raised her hand from across the street in a gesture of support. 3 more neighbors had already come out to their gardens, pretending to water plants that didn't need water, their eyes fixed on my sidewalk. Julio was still with his head under the tow truck's hood. Elias was pouring the first cup of coffee for the mechanic. The stage was set, the audience was in their seats, the documents were on the table. At 8:45, the unmistakable sound of a heavy engine began to vibrate on the asphalt. It was a diesel roar, much more powerful than Julio's tow truck. I looked towards the end of Honeysuckle Lane. A huge, impeccably white moving truck, with the logo of a transport company painted on its metallic sides, slowly turned to enter the block. The vehicle advanced, occupying almost the entire roadway. Behind it, barely showing its aerodynamic hood, came a red sports car, Valentina's car. The moving truck reached the corner and tried to wide turn to maneuver and back up in front of my entrance. But Julio's rusty tow truck was positioned exactly in the blind spot of the turn. The truck driver honked, a strident sound that echoed against the facades of all the houses. Julio, unperturbed, pulled his head out from under the hood, wiped his hands with his dark rag, and gestured to the driver, indicating that the engine was dead. The enormous truck remained diagonally across the street, completely blocking traffic on Honeysuckle Lane. The engine idled, a deep rumble that vibrated my window panes. The door of the red sports car flung open. Valentina emerged from the car. She wore tight leather pants, high boots, and a designer coat that fluttered in the morning breeze. In one hand, she held a cup of coffee from an international chain. In the other, her mobile phone. Her face was a mask of supreme irritation. She slammed her car door shut, strode down the sidewalk, navigating around the blocked truck, and looked up at my house. She stopped dead when she saw Julio and his tow truck. She saw Elias serving coffee. She saw Carmen and the dozen neighbors who were now standing on their sidewalks, watching her in absolute silence. And finally, her eyes climbed the 3 steps of my porch. She saw me, dressed in my archivist chief suit, standing next to Dr. Mendoza and his leather briefcase. Valentina lowered the coffee cup. The arrogant smile with which she had arrived began to fade from the corners of her lips. I took a step forward, placing my hand on the cold iron railing, ready to begin the most important audit of my life. The diesel engine of the moving truck vibrated in the cold morning air, a heavy, rhythmic percussion that seemed to mark the heartbeat of Honeysuckle Lane. It was an enormous vehicle, impeccably white, with the logo of a luxury transport company painted in blue letters along its metallic flanks. Its size was completely disproportionate for our narrow residential street, designed in the 60s for small cars and family station wagons. The driver, a stout man in a reflective vest, tried to maneuver the steel giant to reverse and align the loading ramp exactly in front of my wrought iron gate. However, Julio's rusty tow truck, parked at the most critical angle of the corner, made the operation a geometric impossibility. The truck remained diagonally across the street, blocking both directions of traffic, emitting a hiss of air brakes that echoed against the facades of the neighboring houses. Behind the truck, barely showing its aerodynamic hood, was Valentina's red sports car. The driver's door opened with a violent shove, almost hitting the truck's rear bumper. My granddaughter descended from the vehicle, her mere presence seeming like an archive error in the context of our retiree neighborhood. She wore tight black leather pants, high stiletto boots that clattered against the uneven asphalt, and a camel-colored designer coat that fluttered slightly in the morning breeze. In her left hand, she held a cardboard coffee cup from an expensive international chain. In her right, her latest generation mobile phone, its screen incessantly glowing. Her face, made up with that artificial perfection that young people call natural, was a mask of supreme irritation. She was accustomed to the world getting out of her way with a snap of her fingers, and couldn't conceive that a 30-year-old tow truck would interrupt her schedule of success. Valentina slammed her car door shut, the sound echoing down the block. She strode quickly down the sidewalk, bypassing the white mass of the blocked truck, and headed directly for the tow truck's cab. She didn't look around. She didn't notice Mrs. Carmen sitting in her canvas chair, nor the other neighbors peeking from behind their fences. Her vision was a tunnel, focused solely on the obstacle. "Hey!" Valentina shouted, addressing the front of the tow truck where Julio had half his body tucked under the raised hood. "Hey you, I need you to move this junk immediately. My moving truck has to park here. I have a very tight schedule, and I can't waste time with this." Julio slowly emerged from the engine compartment. He wore a worn wool cap and held a wrench stained with black grease. He wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand and looked at my granddaughter with an expression of absolute and unbreakable rural patience. "Good morning, miss," Julio said, drawing out his words with deliberate slowness, savoring each syllable. "I'd love to help you, believe me, I would. But this poor machine just suffered a massive mechanical heart attack. Injector problem, I reckon, or maybe the fuel pump. It won't start for love nor money." "I'm not interested in your mechanical problems," Valentina retorted, raising her voice a notch, her sharp tone cutting through the morning cold. "Move the vehicle. Push it if you have to, or I'll call traffic police and a municipal tow truck to impound this garbage. You're blocking a public road." Julio let out a raspy chuckle, a harsh sound that would grate any throat, but which came out of him with the naturalness of someone who had smoked black tobacco all his life. He leaned the wrench on the rusted bumper and crossed his arms. "Call the police, miss. Call the fire department if you want. The police can give you a ticket for blocking traffic, but they're not mechanics. And the municipal tow truck will take, at best, about 4 hours to get to this part of town. In the meantime, this 3-ton hulk isn't going to move an inch. But if you want, our neighbor Elias has hot coffee. It's too cold to be shouting so early." Valentina snapped her head sharply towards where Julio was pointing. For the first time, her eyes registered her surroundings. She saw Mr. Elias behind his small folding table, pouring steaming coffee into thermal cups. She saw Julio take one of the cups with a grateful smile. Then her gaze swept the street. She saw Mrs. Carmen with her phone held high, recording the scene with the precision of a documentarian. She saw Mrs. Rosa, Mr. Albert, the retired teacher from the house on the corner. More than a dozen people stood on their porches, on the sidewalks, leaning on their fences, watching her in absolute, accusing silence. No one murmured, no one looked away. The entire neighborhood was cataloging her. The moving truck driver, tired of waiting, turned off the engine, got out of his cab with a plastic folder in hand, and walked towards Valentina. "Miss, we have a problem," the man said, tapping a pen against the folder. "I can't leave the truck across the street. If a patrol car comes, I get the fine. Plus, my guys charge by the hour from the moment we leave the base. If we can't park and start loading the furniture, I'm going to have to charge you for waiting time. And it's not cheap. Nobody is going to charge anyone extra. Valentina exploded, completely losing her fashion designer composure, her voice breaking with frustration. Park wherever you can. On the corner, on the next block, I don't care. Bring your men walking and start taking things out. I'll fix this. She turned, her back to the driver and Julio, and finally looked up at my house. Her eyes swept over the front yard, climbed the 3 concrete steps, and stopped dead. There I stood, in the center of my porch, in my navy blue 2-piece suit, white silk blouse buttoned to the neck, and my low-heeled shoes firmly planted on the tiles Thomas and I chose in 1978. To my right, unmoving as a marble column, stood Dr. Arthur Mendoza, holding his brown leather briefcase with both hands in front of his black wool coat. The arrogance on Valentina's face wavered for a fraction of a second, replaced by genuine confusion, but her pride was a defense mechanism too deeply ingrained to allow her to retreat. She gripped the coffee cup so hard that the plastic lid threatened to give way, and began to walk towards my property. Her boots echoed against the entrance path's tiles. She climbed the 3 porch steps without asking permission, stopping a yard away from us. "Grandma, what is this circus?" she asked, trying to regain her condescending tone of authority, the same one she had used yesterday to tell me I needed supervision. "Did you organize this? Did you pay that old mechanic to block the street? I told you clearly that the transport from Sunset Residence arrives in 15 minutes. You should be inside with your suitcases ready by the door, not out here making a spectacle for your gossipy neighbors." I looked her in the eyes. In the archives, I've seen hundreds of people try to hide their fear behind aggression. I've seen corrupt lawyers shout when they discover a key document has disappeared from their folders. Valentina was no different. She was a flawed file, full of miscalculations, trying to validate itself through the volume of her voice. I didn't answer her. I kept my lips sealed and my expression neutral. Silence, as always, made the void in the conversation unbearable for her. Valentina averted her gaze to the man beside me. She sighed, rolling her eyes with exaggeration. "Oh, right, Arthur Mendoza, the family lawyer. How sweet that you came to say goodbye to my grandma," she said, using the doctor's first name with disrespectful familiarity. "I suppose you're here to offer moral support. It's a nice gesture, Arthur, but completely unnecessary. My dad has already handled all the legal paperwork. He's the rightful owner of this property, and he's ceded full administration to me. So please, help her get inside the house and put on her coat. I don't have time to deal with anyone's nostalgia today. I have contractors waiting for confirmation to start on Friday." Dr. Mendoza didn't alter his posture, didn't frown or show indignation. He simply offered a very slight, cold, professional smile. The executioner's smile, knowing the guillotine has already been greased and tested. "I haven't come to say goodbye to your grandma, Valentina," Mendoza said, his deep, raspy voice projecting with astonishing clarity in the morning air. "I've come to work, and I suggest you mind the tone with which you address the sole legal owner of the usage rights to this house." Valentina let out a dry, humorless laugh. "Legal owner? Arthur, please. My grandfather Thomas passed away years ago. The succession was completed. My dad inherited this house. I saw the papers for the effective possession myself. He signed a broad power of attorney in my favor last week. It's all filed with the notary. You're just 2 old people trying to cling to a past that no longer exists. The paper is signed. The house belongs to my dad, and by extension, it's mine to administer." Mendoza nodded slowly, like a professor listening to a student repeat a fundamentally erroneous concept before failing them in front of the whole class. With deliberate, unhurried movements, he lifted his brown leather briefcase. He rested it on the wrought iron railing of the porch and opened the 2 metal latches. The double click resonated in the silence of the street, so loud that I saw Mrs. Carmen lean forward in her chair not to miss a single detail. Mendoza extracted a thick cardboard folder tied with an official red ribbon from inside the briefcase. He untied the knot, opened the folder, and pulled out a stack of documents printed on heavy-grade paper. The watermarks of the property registrar gleamed under the pale light of the rising sun. The signatures in blue ink and the notary stamps were fresh and crisp. The problem with younger generations, Valentina, is that they confuse the speed of a signature with the depth of the law, Mendoza began, separating the first document and holding it in front of her. Your father, Robert, did indeed inherit the property after Thomas's death, but he inherited what is exclusively known in civil law as bare ownership. Valentina furrowed her brow, her eyes quickly moving over the printed letters Mendoza showed her, trying to decipher the technical language. Bare ownership, that means he owns it. It's the same, she replied, though her voice had lost a fraction of its certainty. No, it's not the same, Mendoza corrected her with the relentless patience of a surgeon operating without anesthesia. Full ownership is divided into two fundamental rights: bare ownership, which is the title to the bricks and the land, and usufruct, which is the absolute right to use, enjoy, and benefit from the asset. Thomas, knowing perfectly well your father's financial immaturity, asked me to draft this clause in 2008. Mendoza turned to the second page, pointing with his index finger to a highlighted paragraph. Read the fine print, Valentina, or better yet, I'll read it to you, since you seem to be in a hurry. A life usufruct, irrevocable and exclusive, is hereby established in favor of Mrs. Teresa over the entirety of the property located on Honeysuckle Lane. The bare owner, Mr. Robert, may not, under any circumstances, sell, lease, structurally modify, or demand the eviction of the usufructuary, Mrs. Teresa, retaining absolute dominion over the use of the property until the day of her death. That must have expired. My dad signed a broad power, a notarized power of attorney. Arthur, a notary validated it last week. I have the document in my bag. A notary validates that your father's signature is authentic, Valentina. Not that your father has the power to do what he promises, Mendoza explained, closing the folder with a dry movement. Your father granted you a broad power of attorney over a right he does not possess. He cannot cede the administration of this house because he does not administer it. Teresa does. Your father gave you an empty safe, and you, in your arrogance, didn't even bother to verify if he had the combination before you started spending the money you thought was inside. The power of attorney you have in your bag isn't worth the cost of the ink it was printed with. Liar! Valentina screamed, losing her temper completely, the word escaping her lips with the crudeness of a spoiled child whose toy has just been taken away. You're making this up! My dad checked everything. My dad told me the house was free. I'm calling him right now. You're scammers. Valentina placed her coffee cup on the porch railing, a clumsy gesture that made dark drops splash onto the freshly painted iron. She pulled out her mobile phone with trembling hands, her long, manicured fingers typed on the screen with desperation. She activated the speaker and held the device in front of us as if the object itself were a protective shield. The ringtone resonated on the porch. 1, 2, 3. Hello? Robert's voice sounded metallic and hurried through the speaker. In the background, the sound of keyboards and phones from his office could be heard. Val, I'm about to go into a management meeting. Has the truck been loaded yet? Did you have problems with Grandma? I told you, if she got stubborn to call the paramedics from the nursing home, they know how to handle disoriented elderly people. The murmur of the neighbors in the street stopped completely. My son's voice, suggesting I be treated like a psychiatric patient to facilitate his real estate fraud, floated in the cold air, naked and pathetic. Julio clenched his jaw, and Mrs. Carmen put a hand to her mouth. Dad, listen to me, Valentina shrieked, ignoring her surroundings, her eyes wide and fixed on Mendoza. Grandma's lawyer is here, Arthur Mendoza. He has a paper that says Grandma has a life estate, that you only have bare ownership, and that you can't evict her or remodel the house. Tell me that was annulled in the succession. Tell me the power you signed for me is valid. There was an absolute silence on the other end of the line. The background noise of Robert's office seemed to disappear. Only his heavy, then broken breathing could be heard, like a man who has just stepped into a void. Dad! Valentina insisted, her voice trembling for the first time. Dad, Are you listening to me? The notary told you you were the universal owner, right? The notary told me I inherited half my dad's title, Robert stammered, his voice shrinking to a pathetic whisper. I thought that when he died, the house would be completely in my name. I never checked the annexes at the registrar's office. Val, you told me you needed the power quickly to sign with the contractors. I just signed what your lawyer sent me. Mendoza leaned towards the phone Valentina was holding. I warned you in 2008, Robert, the lawyer said, his tone implacable. I told you we were giving you a safe without the combination. You assumed Thomas's death erased the protections he himself built against your incompetence. You have signed a fraudulent power, Robert. You have tried to dispose of an asset that is legally shielded by your mother's right of use. Dad! Valentina screamed, tears of panic finally appearing in her eyes, ruining her perfect makeup. You told me you were the owner. I signed a contract based on your title. I have financial commitments starting this Friday. Val, I didn't know. I thought Grandma would go quietly to the nursing home and no one would ask any questions. Robert's voice was a whimper of cowardice. He realized the magnitude of his error and resorted to his oldest tactic, flight. I'm going to call my lawyer. I'm going to see how we can fix this. Don't do anything yet. The sound of the cut call, 3 dry, monotonous beeps, was the only answer Valentina received. Her father had abandoned her, leaving her alone to face the structural collapse of her lies. Valentina slowly lowered the phone. Her face was pale, devoid of all the blood and arrogance that had driven her until this moment. She looked at me. She no longer saw the fragile old woman who needed supervision. She saw the concrete wall against which she had just crashed her life at 120 miles an hour. I took a step forward. The sound of my heels on the porch made Valentina flinch. It was my turn to conduct the final audit. Yesterday afternoon, you entered my house without knocking, I began. My voice was low, level, cutting the air with the precision of a scalpel. You filled the hallways my husband built with cardboard boxes. You entered my bedroom. You opened my closets and put garbage bags on my bed so I would discard my history myself. You told me this house was too big for me. You told me you needed this space, and that I needed medical supervision because, according to you, we old people forget things. Valentina opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. She was hyperventilating. But in the archives, Valentina, no one forgets anything. Everything is recorded. Everything is read. Even the documents you carelessly leave on the dining table while you go to the kitchen to plan the destruction of my walls. Valentina's eyes widened. The memory of her transparent folder struck her physically. She took a step back, bumping against the iron railing. Her elbow hit the coffee cup she had left there, knocking it over. The dark, hot liquid spilled over the iron and fell directly onto the tips of her expensive designer boots, staining the impeccable leather. She didn't even look down. The investment contract and commercial partnership agreement. I recited from memory, pronouncing each word with the clarity of someone reading a death sentence. Signed by you and San Roman Investments. An initial contribution of $50,000 for the machinery and inventory of your clothing brand. You contributed this property, which does not belong to you, as collateral and headquarters. Valentina put her hands to her head, her fingers tangling in her perfectly straightened hair. No, 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 she murmured, shaking her head repeatedly, as if her words could turn back time. But what really caught my attention as an archivist, I continued, taking another step towards her, cornering her against the railing, was the penalty clause in the 3rd paragraph, that small print that young people never read. Penalty clause in the 3rd paragraph, that small print that young people never read. In the event that the receiving party does not deliver physical possession and clear occupancy of the property before Friday of the current week, the contract will be null and void, and they must return the full capital plus a penalty for damages equivalent to 100% of the amount contributed. I felt the absolute warmth of justice executed with precision. $100,000, Valentina, I said, my voice falling like a steel hammer on an anvil. You gambled $100,000 you don't have, using a house you can't touch, backed by a father who doesn't know what he's signing. And today is Wednesday. You have 48 hours to deliver to San Roman Investments a design studio that will never exist. Valentina let out a choked sob. Her knees seemed to lose strength, and she had to cling to the coffee-stained railing to keep from falling to the floor of my porch. Her entire facade of a successful businesswoman had crumbled in less than 10 minutes, revealing a frightened girl who had just signed her own financial ruin. At that moment, the moving truck driver, who had been observing the scene from the sidewalk with his arms crossed, climbed the first step of the porch. His patience had completely run out. "Miss," the man said, tapping his pen against the folder again. "I don't know what kind of legal problem you have here, but I'm not getting involved in a property dispute. If you don't have the keys and permission to empty this house, we're leaving, and I'm charging you the last-minute cancellation fee. It's $500. I need your credit card right now, or I'm calling the police to report fraudulent service." Valentina turned her head towards the man, her face bathed in tears of public humiliation. The neighbors in the street were no longer silent. A low, constant murmur rippled through the block, the sound of 40 years of community loyalty celebrating the invader's downfall. Mrs. Carmen was still recording, ensuring that every second of this defeat was archived in the neighborhood's digital memory. Before Valentina could stammer a response to the truck driver, a new vehicle turned the corner, barely managing to avoid Julio's tow truck and the stalled moving truck. It was a gleaming white high-top van, with golden letters painted on the side that read, "Sunset Residence, your well-being is our priority." The rear doors opened, and two orderlies quickly descended. They wore immaculate light blue medical uniforms. One of them unfolded a portable wheelchair on the sidewalk, while the other, a young woman with a clipboard, walked directly towards my porch with a professional, standardized smile. "Good morning," the orderly announced loudly, her enthusiasm clashing violently with the devastated atmosphere of the scene. "We're from Sunset to pick up Mrs. Teresa. We have the room ready and the welcome menu prepared. Who is the family member in charge? We were informed that the patient might be a little disoriented and would need supervision during the transfer." Mendoza let out a low chuckle and put his documents back in his briefcase. I maintained my upright posture, slowly turned my head towards the orderly, and offered her a polite smile. "I am Teresa," I said, with a firm, serene voice, "and I thank you very much for your punctuality. However, there has been an error in the classification of the file. I do not need medical supervision or transfer. I am in perfect condition to manage my property." The orderly blinked in confusion, looking at my impeccable suit and my absolute lack of disorientation. She looked at her clipboard and then at Valentina, who was still clinging to the railing, crying silently with coffee-stained boots. "The person who prepaid the semester is my granddaughter, Valentina," I continued, gesturing gently with my hand, "and I believe it is with her that you should speak. I'm afraid she's going to need you to cancel the contract and process an urgent refund. She's experiencing a catastrophic financial crisis, and frankly, I think she's the one who needs supervision right now, although I very much doubt that the nursing home refund will be enough to cover the $100,000 she owes her investors." The orderly looked at Valentina, then at the truck driver who was demanding payment, and finally at the crowd of neighbors watching from the street. The situation surpassed any of the residents' protocols. Valentina's mobile phone, which was still in her trembling hand, began to vibrate and ring with a strident melody. The screen lit up, projecting a name in large letters that I could clearly read from where I stood. Fernando San Roman, investor. I adjusted the pearl brooch on my jacket lapel, feeling the fresh morning air cleanse the smell of cardboard and glue that had infected my home. The audit was complete, the damage was catalogued, and the debt was finally about to be collected. Valentina's mobile phone vibrated in her hand with the fury of a trapped insect, emitting a sharp hum that cut through the cold morning air. The screen flickered incessantly, illuminating the name Fernando San Roman in large, menacing letters. My granddaughter stood paralyzed, her gaze fixed on the device as if she suddenly held a grenade from which the pin had already been pulled. Her breathing became erratic, shallow, her chest rising and falling under her designer coat as panic snatched away any trace of the arrogance with which she had arrived. I didn't move. I kept my hands clasped in front of my waist, observing the scene with the same clinical precision with which I used to review expropriation files in the municipal archive. When a building is constructed on false foundations, collapse is not a tragedy. It is simply the inevitable correction of a structural error. The phone stopped ringing for a second, only to restart its strident melody almost immediately. San Roman was not a man who accepted silence as an answer. With trembling fingers, and knowing that everyone present on Honeysuckle Lane had their eyes glued to her, Valentina slid her thumb across the green screen. She brought the device to her ear, but her hand trembled so much that she had to hold it with both hands. Fernando? She stammered, her voice barely a fragile thread. A far cry from the young businesswoman dictating orders about drywall and large windows. I didn't need to get closer to hear the investor's voice. The silence on my porch was so absolute that San Roman's words, filtered through the earpiece, resonated with brutal clarity. Valentina, the man said, his tone devoid of any courtesy, heavy and direct. My assistant just went to City Hall to check the building permits for the remodeling on Honeysuckle Lane. He informs me that there is no application filed in your name, or your father's, or my company's. And what's worse, the property record indicates that property has an active life estate. Can you explain what the hell this means? My contractors are starting Friday, and I need the keys today. Valentina closed her eyes tightly. A few black tears, stained by mascara, slid down her pale cheeks. Fernando, please, listen to me. There was a small legal misunderstanding with my grandfather's estate. She tried to articulate, desperately trying to buy time. An impossible reprieve. My dad is sorting it out with the lawyers. I swear the house will be clear. I just need a few more days. A couple of weeks, maybe. We can delay the start of the work. I'll cover the cost of the contractors. Delay? San Roman's laugh was short, harsh, and completely humorless. You signed a guaranteed contract, Valentina. You assured me you had free and peaceful possession of the property. You made me transfer $50,000 to your supposed brand's account based on fraud. That's not a legal misunderstanding. That's a scam. And I don't do business with scammers. It's not a scam. The money is intact in the account. I'll return it to you right now, she shouted, desperation completely breaking her voice. The contract stipulates a 100% penalty for breach and damages. Valentina, $100,000. You have until tomorrow at 5 in the afternoon to deposit that exact amount into the San Roman Investments account. If the money isn't there, my lawyers will file a criminal complaint for procedural fraud and embezzlement, and I will request a precautionary embargo on all your and your father's accounts. Don't call me again unless it's to send me the transfer receipt. The call ended with a dry, definitive click. Valentina's arm fell heavily to her side. The phone slipped from her powerless fingers and hit the tiles of my porch, the screen shattering into a dozen luminous cracks. She made no attempt to pick it up. She stared into the void, her disoriented eyes reflecting the financial abyss into which she had just fallen due to her own arrogance. The moving truck driver, who had witnessed the entire conversation with his arms akimbo, showed not an ounce of pity. In his world, time was money, and Valentina had already made him lose too much of both. He advanced another step, invading my granddaughter's personal space, and raised his plastic folder. $100,000 or not, miss. You owe me for my time, the man said, pulling a wireless payment terminal from his pocket. $500 for the service cancellation at the door and the truck blockage. And I want it right now, or I'm calling my boss to send traffic police. Valentina blinked, shaking her head as if coming out of a trance. She opened her designer leather handbag with clumsy, almost robotic movements. She pulled out a thick wallet and extracted a golden credit card. She handed it to the driver without looking him in the face. The man inserted the card into the machine, typed the amount, and waited. Seconds later, the device emitted a low beep, and a message in red letters illuminated the small screen. Denied, the driver announced, returning the plastic with a gesture of disdain. Your bank didn't authorize the charge. Do you have another? Or I'll call the patrol. Valentina's face crumbled even further, if that were possible. Her father, in a panic attack after the previous call, had surely already begun to freeze shared credit lines to protect what little he had left. She rummaged in her wallet, pulled out a worn blue debit card, the one she used during her student years, and extended it to the man. The driver swiped it. This time, the machine processed the payment, printing a paper receipt that the man tore off with a yank. "Thanks," the driver mumbled. Then he turned to me and touched the brim of his cap in a gesture of respect. "Apologies for the inconvenience, ma'am. Have a good day." The man descended the porch steps and walked towards his immense white truck. But Valentina's humiliation wasn't over yet. The orderly from Sunset Residence, who had been watching the debacle with wide eyes, cautiously approached. She no longer wore that standardized smile. Now, she just wanted to close her file and get off Honeysuckle Lane as quickly as possible. "Miss Valentina," the orderly said, handing her the clipboard and a plastic pen. "Since the patient does not require our services and refuses transfer, I need you to sign this voluntary discharge and cancellation form." Valentina took the pen with a hand that trembled uncontrollably. "The money I paid for the semester," my granddaughter stammered, her mind clinging to any lifeline amidst the shipwreck. "I need it refunded, today, to the same account from which I made the transfer." The orderly adjusted her posture, adopting the bureaucratic tone of someone who has delivered bad news hundreds of times. "As I explained to you by phone when you made the reservation, miss, cancellations with less than 72 hours notice incur a 20% retention for administrative expenses and room blockage. The remaining 80% will be processed within 15 to 20 business days, subject to the approval of the finance department. It's all detailed in Clause 4 of the contract you signed. Please sign here below." The coup de grace, the irony of the fine print. The same fine print Valentina had ignored at the property registrar's office, the same she had ignored in the San Roman contract. Now it returned to bite her for the third time in less than half an hour. 15 business days. By then, San Roman's lawsuit would already be in court, and her accounts would be frozen. Valentina scrawled an illegible scribble on the paper and handed the clipboard back to the orderly, who nodded quickly, turned around, and walked back to her white van. Silence fell over the porch again. "Doctor." Mendoza closed the clasps of his leather briefcase with a double metallic click, a sound that marked the official end of the audit. He glanced at me, nodded slightly, and descended the steps, walking to his grey sedan without another word. His work was done. I was left alone with Valentina. She was still leaning against the iron railing, the dry coffee stain darkening the leather of her boot. Her breathing dissolved into silent sobs. There was no compassion in my chest. For decades I had invested my time, my money, and my care in this child and her father, and their only response had been to try to pack me in cardboard boxes as if I were trash. Justice is not always a noisy act of revenge. Sometimes it is simply allowing the weight of reality to crush those who believe themselves above it. I turned and opened the front door of my house. The smell of cardboard and glue hit me immediately. Valentina's boxes were still there, obstructing my hallway, profaning my space, a physical reminder of her insolence. I slowly turned and looked at her over my shoulder. "You have exactly 10 minutes to get your garbage out of my house, Valentina," I said. My voice was flat and devoid of any emotion. "If at 9:15 there's a single one of your boxes inside my property, I will authorize the neighbors to burn them in the middle of the street." I went inside and left the door wide open. I walked to the kitchen, poured myself a glass of cold water, and sat in the dining room chair, waiting. I didn't have to wait long. I heard the sound of heavy footsteps climbing onto the porch, but they weren't Valentina's heels. They were work boots, sneakers, and the metallic clinking of Mrs. Carmen's cane. I peered into the hallway. Julio, the mechanic, stood in the doorway, accompanied by Mr. Elias and two of Carmen's sons, burly young men who always greeted me with respect when they returned from college. Outside, on the porch, Valentina watched the scene, completely paralyzed, unable to articulate an order, unable to defend her supposed territory. "With your permission, Mrs. Teresa," Julio said, taking off his grease-stained cap for a second before putting it back on. "We figured at your age you shouldn't be doing any heavy lifting. We'll take care of the cleanup." I nodded. What followed was the methodical, swift, and humiliating demolition of Valentina's cardboard empire. The men from the neighborhood entered my house and began to lift the heavy boxes labeled linen fabrics and color swatches. They didn't treat them with the care the labels demanded. They lifted them and carried them out to the street, stacking them directly on the dirty sidewalk next to my granddaughter's red sports car. The sound of the boxes scraping against the walls disappeared. The hallway began to clear. Mrs. Carmen entered behind the men, went directly to my bedroom, and 5 minutes later emerged, dragging the 3 black garbage bags Valentina had left on my bed. Carmen threw them onto the porch with a gesture of deep contempt, right at Valentina's feet. "So you can pack your dignity, child, if you ever had any," Carmen snapped, leaning on her cane. In less than 10 minutes, my house breathed again. Natural light flowed once more from the back window to the front door without obstruction. The smell of industrial glue began to dissipate, replaced by the fresh morning breeze and the aroma of Mr. Elias's coffee wafting in from the street. Julio and the boys came out one last time. The mechanic descended the steps, walked to his rusty tow truck, climbed into the cab, and magically, the diesel engine started on the first try. Julio shifted gears and pulled the tow truck away from the corner, clearing the blockage. The driver of the immense white moving truck, who had been waiting, smoking a cigarette, crushed the butt against the asphalt, climbed into his vehicle, and started the engine. The truck reversed with a warning beep, turned heavily, and drove away down Honeysuckle Lane, taking with it the threat of eviction. Seconds later, the Sunset residence van followed the same path, disappearing from our ecosystem. Valentina was left alone on the sidewalk. She was surrounded by 40 boxes stacked haphazardly on the cold concrete. Her sports car didn't have capacity for even a quarter of that volume. The neighbors, from their gardens and windows, watched her in a deathly silence. No one insulted her. No one yelled at her. The punishment was absolute indifference, total exclusion from the support network she had scorned. I walked to the threshold of my door. Valentina looked up, her red, swollen eyes meeting mine. There was no longer defiance, only the absolute recognition of her own insignificance against the strength of my archives. I closed the front door, slid the bolt, double-locked it, and listened to the metallic click that sealed my dominion over the space. I didn't look out the window again. I wasn't interested in knowing how long it would take her to cram her miseries into that small car, or whom she would have to beg to help her carry the rest. My house was clean, and the cataloguing of this threat was complete. 6 months passed, and silence and peace returned to my home, consolidating the structure of my life with the same firmness with which Dr. Mendoza had drafted the life estate clause. It was Thursday afternoon. I had prepared a porcelain teapot with lemon verbena infusion and placed it on the mahogany dining table alongside a plate of butter cookies Mr. Elias had sent me that very morning. The house was warm. The heating system worked perfectly thanks to the repairs Julio had performed in exchange for me organizing the commercial patent papers for his workshop. The doorbell rang at 4 o'clock. I went to open it. Dr. Arthur Mendoza stood on the porch, wrapped in his black coat, holding his eternal leather briefcase. "Come in, Arthur. The tea is served," I said, stepping aside to let him pass. Mendoza entered, hung his coat on the oak coat rack in the hallway, and walked towards the dining room with the familiarity of old times. He sat in the chair opposite me, opened his briefcase, and took out a small, thin grey folder, very different from the voluminous file he had brought 6 months ago. "I'm not here to collect fees, Teresa. Don't worry," Mendoza joked, taking a cookie and nibbling on it. "But I thought your archivist mind would like to have the official closure of this file. The judicial resolutions were published yesterday in the official Gazette." I poured the tea into the 2 cups, watching the steam spiral upwards towards the ceiling. "I'm listening, Arthur. Incomplete data ruins any archive." Mendoza put the cookie down on the plate, immediately adopting his professional posture, adjusting his glasses on the bridge of his nose. San Roman Investments didn't mince words. The day after the incident, they filed the lawsuit for fraud and breach of contract. Valentina, in a desperate attempt to avoid jail, turned to Robert. Your son, who has always been a coward but never a criminal, realized that the power of attorney he himself signed made him an accessory to the fraud. If Valentina fell, he fell with her. I nodded slowly, sipping my tea. The legal logic was impeccable. To pay the $100,000 penalty and the costs of the defense lawyers, Robert had to liquidate absolutely everything, Mendoza continued, reading excerpts from the grey folder. The bank foreclosed on his downtown apartment because he stopped making payments. He had to sell his truck and empty his retirement funds. They managed to reach an out-of-court settlement with San Roman to drop the criminal charges, but they were left in absolute ruin. Where are they now? I asked. I felt neither sorrow nor joy. I felt the same neutrality with which I noted the expiration date on an old record. Robert is renting a small room in a boarding house in the south of the city. He works in administration at a small auto parts shop, trying to pay off the usurious loans he took to cover the remaining debt. He's aged Teresa. I saw him leave the courthouse last week, and he looked 10 years older. Mendoza paused, stirring his tea with a silver spoon, the clinking filling the silence of the dining room. And Valentina? I inquired, recalling the coffee-stained boots and the designer coat. The clothing brand was liquidated to pay back taxes. There's no longer a design studio, no windows with northern light, no meetings with suppliers. She works in a discount clothing store at a mall in the suburbs. She's on her feet 8 hours a day, folding t-shirts and arranging hangers for minimum wage. I'm informed that her arrogant attitude has already cost her 2 firings in these 6 months, and she lives in a constant state of bitterness. They tried to expel you from your home to build an empire on your memory, and they ended up exiled to the darkest, smallest corners of the city. Mendoza closed the grey folder and gently pushed it across the table towards me. It's yours, for your archives. I took the folder. The cardboard was cold. Inside, copies of the embargoes and liquidations detailed, number by number, the exact cost of underestimating a woman who spent 40 years ordering the chaos of the world. Robert and Valentina tried to use bureaucracy as a blunt weapon against me, but they forgot that I was the architect of that very system. They had returned my peace of mind using the same mechanism they employed to try to destroy it. Mendoza finished his tea. We talked a little longer about joint pains and the weather, and finally, he said goodbye. I walked him to the door. Outside, Mrs. Carmen was sweeping the sidewalk, and seeing us, she raised her hand in a warm greeting. Mendoza got into his car and drove away. I closed the door. The silence of the house enveloped me like a familiar embrace. I walked down the clear hallway, running my hand over the intact wallpaper, feeling the solidity of the walls Valentina had dreamed of tearing down. I reached my bedroom and turned on the small nightstand lamp. I sat on the edge of the bed on the hand-knitted quilt. I extended my arms and took the cedar box that rested on my nightstand. The wood, polished by years and touch, was warm. I opened the lid carefully. The smell of antique tobacco and preserved paper filled my senses. Inside were Thomas's letters, his medals, and the thick manila envelope with the original life estate document. I took the grey folder Mendoza had just given me. I meticulously folded it in half, making sure the edges matched perfectly, and placed it at the bottom of the box beneath my husband's mementos. Then I took out my green hardcover notebook, found a black ink pen in the drawer, and opened the notebook to the last blank page. With my round, firm, precise handwriting, the same that had filled thousands of folios in the municipal archive, I wrote today's date. Below, I drew a single line, closed the notebook, and put it away with the documents. I lowered the lid of the cedar box until I heard the faint rustle of the wood clicking into place. I turned off the lamp, stood up, and walked to the living room window, watching as evening slowly fell over Honeysuckle Lane, knowing that tomorrow at 8 o'clock I would once again step out with my coat buttoned to buy bread in a world that remained exactly under my control.